Okay, so we're going to try to finish up. What do we do with the long endings of Mark, the various endings? And last week we left off with dealing with internal arguments. And we started with some of the claims that Mark didn't write the longer ending because it uses unique vocabulary. And we worked through the unique vocabulary and pretty much came to the conclusion that using unique vocabulary is not a great metric to try to determine who wrote what, because you have to set the expectation that they would have used that vocabulary in another circumstance. And most of these, that was not the case. We would find there's no reason for Mark to have used the word snake except in this context, or the number 11, and some of these other ones. You have to raise that expectation. So instead of looking at vocabulary, we decided to look at style. And so we moved into style, and we looked at some of the interesting, but not as weighty, but interesting stylistic choices Mark makes that he doesn't make, or makes a different decision in the longer ending, such as using the word euthys for immediately, or palin for again. The fact that he only calls Jesus Lord Jesus in the longer ending is interesting. It could be narrative, though, just because now it's post-resurrection. It could be. So I don't put a ton of weight on these ones. Or for Euthys and Pallas, well, the people who are really studying this stuff, they're saying there may not be a huge expectation to see Euthys or Palin in the long ending. So it's hard to say that he should have used it here. Remember, it's only roughly 12 verses. So, you got to set the expectation for how long of a passage do we normally go before we see such things, and 12 verses is a small portion. And then Kyrios, he doesn't use Kyrios as a divine title. That is generally true in the Gospel of Mark, but the very first two uses, I do believe, are divine titles and explicit towards Jesus. So I have no problem with bookending the Gospel of Mark with divine titles for Lord Jesus in the beginning of the Gospel, and Kyrios as a divine title at the end of the Gospel. I think that's reasonable, and I have no qualms with this one, so this one is not very weighty on me as well. A change in resurrection narrative, the fact that he uses a passive construction of the verb he has risen versus an active he rose, verses 6 and 9. Again, we worked through this one. To me, this just seems like moving from the angel's quote to a narrative. And so I didn't find this one very weighty either. This one I did find a little bit more interesting, only because I was getting agreement on both sides that the narrative connection between verses 8 and 9 grammatically is literally awkward. And this was largely due to the fact that the pronouns in verse 8 are they, speaking of the women, and then he in verse 9, speaking of Jesus. This is awkward in Greek not to have a concrete noun referencing Jesus before we start using pronouns again. So awkward in Greek. It's a little awkward in English as well, but not quite as jarring. It doesn't hit us as hard. It does hit hard in Greek. It's like, that's weird. Okay. And so both sides agreed on this, that this is jarring in Greek. At least Snap agreed with guys like Head and Wasserman and Wallace that this is different. Lund, not so much. But again, I made the case. I think that Snap is the better Greek scholar of the two. And then the reintroduction of the characters in verse 9. This one I thought was actually pretty interesting. The fact that they reintroduce Mary, and in the reintroduction of Mary, they give her more descriptors to make it clear who this Mary Magdalene is. And that is uncommon to do at the end of a narrative as opposed to the beginning of a narrative. And so the fact that she is the Mary Magdalene who had 7 demons cast out of her. Luke is the only other one who uses those descriptors, and he uses it at the first time he introduces Mary Magdalene. That's the norm. That's what we expect. For Mary Magdalene to be introduced multiple times in the Gospel of Mark, never received those descriptors, and then the very last time he's introducing her, he then gives her those descriptives. That's weird. That's not what we're used to seeing. So I found that one interesting. Then we moved into some of the more technical ones. Markan uses of the words of the conjunctions kai and day, mostly synonymous, meaning and, also, and but. I actually got a lot of feedback from this last week, how this section was especially interesting combined with the last one when it came to style. And just so we're somewhat clear, I'll be a little bit more clear now in the review. Kai and day are mostly synonymous. They can be used interchangeably, but day has a wider semantic range than kai does, for those who are interested. So the way I would kind of say it is day can do everything kai can do, but kai can't do everything day can do, if that makes sense semantically. Okay, so, and it's very common in the Greek language, I should say the Greek writing culture, that people would generally prefer day. All right, and this comes down to a stylistic thing. Stylistically, most writers in the first century and surrounding centuries who write in Greek, they don't use one exclusively over the other generally. They will use one more than the other, and the weight is almost always on day. Almost all the Greek writers, they all use day. Mark is the opposite. His weight is heavily on kai. And he uses kai in a very stylistic way that is similar to Hebrew. He's being very clearly influenced by Hebrew writing, the way he writes. He writes like a Hebrew would write, but he writes in Greek. So the vav in Hebrew, and always connecting the thoughts. That's how Mark writes, and. And so when you read Mark, it's interesting because of his use of immediately, again, and. And so as you read Mark, you don't feel like you're ever getting time to take a breath. Like he's always connecting you right to the next story, right to the next thought, which is why I say Mark is the gospel of action, right? It's just one action story to the next action story. If you're someone who does not like boring details like Luke gives, where he gives you the color of the grass, Mark is more, and I'm serious, he does. Mark is more interesting in getting to the meat of the next matter, okay? So I say this because this is good when you're dealing with new Christians. When you deal with new Christians, they generally are going to ask you at some point, where should I start reading the Bible? And 9 times out of 10, I'm going to recommend a gospel. And 9 times out of 10, I'm not going to recommend Matthew, because Matthew is very heavily written to a Jewish audience. And if you don't have a heavy background in the Old Testament, a lot of his references are just going to go over your head. You're just not going to catch them. So I generally would start with Mark, Luke, or John, and I'll base it off of their personality. What do you like to read generally? Are you someone who's in the nitty-gritty of history? You love history? You love learning about dates, times, and people? Read Luke. Are you not into that? That's too, I'd prefer to read like an action novel. I'd prefer to read like a fantasy novel, something of that nature. You prefer like, hey, let's get this story moving, or you're not a big reader at all. Maybe that's the person as well. I'm not a big reader. I don't care to read. Start with Mark. Mark's going to just plow you right through the stories. He's going to get you all the pertinent information, everything you need to know, drive through it. Maybe you're more philosophically minded. You're like, I like philosophy. I like reading about human nature and things of that nature. Read John. John's who I'm going to recommend. So that's just like a little side note. That's what I do. And if they do happen to be a Jewish person, I'm going to be like, read Matthew, because he wrote it to you. Eventually you'll get through all the Gospels, but new Christian, where do I start? That's usually how I start them. Okay, so moving on, kind of side trail there. Then we see verse 19 where there's a men-un. Men-un is the construction used in verse 19, which is highly uncharacteristic of Mark. He uses both men and un, but he doesn't use them together like this, so then, or so that. This would be a good place for him to use a kai. Stylistically speaking, this would be the kind of place he would use it, but it doesn't show up here, and he doesn't use men-un like that. So that's interesting. Then the next question is, This is where we left off last week. Mark's use of the historic present. And if you remember last week, I said that if you have an NASB Bible, the historic present is marked for you. So we read the example last week where you see they came with an asterisk, and then in verse 4, they noticed with an asterisk. And what the historic present is in Greek, you can say things that do not work in English, tense-wise, right? So if I said, yesterday I went to the store, that sounds perfectly normal. But if I said, yesterday I go to the store, you'd be like, no, why are you using the present tense? It's you got to use the past tense. Yesterday you went. So what these are is in Greek, you can actually use the present tense when referring to a past tense action. This is normal in Greek. It's not normal in English. So the NASB family of translations is, like I said last week, I think they're the only translation that does it. So NASB family, 77, 95, 20, and LSB. Those are all in the NASB family. They will all mark when they translate into the past tense what is in Greek, the historic present tense. What good does that do you as an English reader? Absolutely nothing, unless you're doing this kind of work. Then it's helpful. If you can't read Greek and you want to do this work, then having a translation that marks it for you is actually helpful, because that's what I did. So I went through and I started counting the asterisks. I'll explain why in a moment. So Mark loves using the historic present, okay? He likes using it. He uses it a lot. And ratio-wise, Mark is also the shortest gospel. So the amount of times Mark uses it is numerically larger than most of the other Gospels, but ratio-wise, he far exceeds their use by word count. Like if you go full word count to how many times he uses the historic present, he exceeds them significantly. So let's look at those numbers. So the historic present, Matthew uses it 78 times, and Luke uses it 4 to 6 times. Now, just so you're aware, I want to make this clear. The historic present, there's a commentary. I think it's on my previous slide. I want to make sure I get the name right. The commentary is called Horae Synopticae. It's actually in English, even though its title is not. But they have a section in the commentary where they list out the synoptic gospels' uses of the historic present for each gospel. So that's where I got these numbers. All right, so it's from this commentary. So according to this commentary, Matthew uses it 78 times. Luke uses it 4 to 6 times. And the reason why we say 4 to 6 times is because 2 of them are textual variants. They were either in the present tense or they were in the, they were either in the past tense or they were in the historic present, and it's a variant. So if we accept the variant, 6 times. If we don't accept the variant, 4 times, okay? 2 of them. All right, so 4 to 6 times Luke uses the historic present. Mark uses it 151 times, all right? And then John uses it, now, the commentary that I was using was the Synoptic Gospels. So John's not included. So I got the numbers from John by physically opening an NASB and counting all the asterisks, which is why there's a question mark there, because I don't know if I counted it perfectly, okay? I might have missed one. I might have counted a couple of them twice when I was like, wait a minute, did I miss that one? Let me recount this page again. So roughly 162 times, okay? I only added John because the synoptic commentary did not, and I was just purely curious. So I went and counted them, and I was surprised by how many times John used it, because it's very high and numerically higher than Mark. But then when you start looking at word count, it's about 33% larger roughly. John's gospel is about 33% larger and only has 7 more times 11 more times of being used than Mark does. So interesting. Either way, Mark uses it a lot. John also uses a lot. So with that, we can say this amount of usage is not purely Markan, but it is interesting that Mark uses it frequently. So this is something Mark does as well as John. These 2 guys both do this. But Matthew and Luke do not use it nearly as much, especially Luke. Luke, you can see he hardly ever uses it. So then let's look at how many times is the historic present used in the longer ending. Since Mark does this frequently, 0 times. There are 0 uses of the longer ending in the Gospel of, there are 0 uses of the longer ending, 0 uses of the historic present. That's what I'm trying to say. There are 0 uses of the historic present in the longer ending. That's what I'm trying to say. So that's interesting that he doesn't use the historic present at all if he wrote the longer ending. All right. So then let's move on to the next one. So that's an interesting stylistic issue. Mark's use of the demonstrative pronouns, okay? They're listed up there for you, and for whatever reason, I can't remember how to pronounce them, so I'm not going to try at this moment. I'll just butcher it. But the demonstrative pronoun is the English equivalent of saying something to the effect of that or those or these, okay? It's when you're pointing to a known set of items, and you're saying those items, that item, okay? And that's a demonstrative pronoun, all right? And the way Mark uses demonstrative pronouns is unique in the longer ending than in the rest of the gospel, though it does appear elsewhere, okay? So it's not exclusive, but it does appear elsewhere. So Mark uses demonstrative pronouns approximately 41 times in his gospel. And stylistically, when he does use them, he never uses them like he does at the particular long ending, particularly verse 17. Okay, verse 17 in this passage. What you need to understand here is in Greek, word order is not super important. Okay, word order is not super important. We know what the subject of the sentence is and what the direct object of the sentence is, usually because of their relationship in location to the main verb, generally speaking. Okay? So we know what the subject of a sentence is because generally it's going to precede the main verb and the direct object is going to proceed the main verb. Okay? It's going to follow. Word order in English is super important. Where you put an adjective, where you put an adverb, where you put these things can impact the meaning of the text. Greek, not so much. Greek is a highly inflective language. And what that means is they will tell you what the word is referring to and its grammar usage based on prefixes and suffixes. Okay? So if it has a particular suffix, it might be the subject. If it has a different suffix, it might be the direct object. Okay? So word order's not super important. You can pretty much rearrange the words in Greek and get the same meaning. You can't do that in English because their grammatical usages are based on suffix. The reason why that's important is because what ends up happening is word order becomes highly stylistic. Okay? How someone orientates the words in a sentence becomes a style issue, not a grammar issue. Okay? So they can rearrange it. And what they'll do is they'll create their own style. This was similar to how I can tell what people are doing in my line of work when I'm reading through code and I'm seeing when do they put this particular line of code? Do they put it at the bottom of the program? Or do they put it in the middle of the program? Do they put it immediately after the feature that they just measured? Or do they wait and they put it with another group of features? That's a style issue because it doesn't matter where they put it, generally speaking. It doesn't matter where they put it. And so I know who's doing what because of where they put it when relative to when the other pieces of information are there. I can pick up on that. Same thing happens in Greek. People can read it and be like, this is how he does things. All right. So all of this is coming up because when you look at Mark 16:17, you're going to see the demonstrative pronoun these, referring to the signs, these signs, okay? So the demonstrative pronoun, these signs, okay, normally are going to be near each other in a sentence when it comes to Mark. Mark puts them close together. His demonstrative pronoun and his concrete noun are going to be right near each other. But in Mark 16:17, it's interesting that he has 3 whole words separating these and signs. That is unlike anything else you see in Mark. He uses demonstrative pronouns, but for him to separate it like that, you don't see elsewhere. To have 3 whole words between these and signs that demonstrative, that's a lot for him. He normally keeps them right next to each other. It's a style issue. It's not a grammar issue. This is just how Mark tends to use these. Now, normally stuff like this does not impact my view, but when I start building this case and I start seeing style issue after style issue after style issue, and knowing that in Greek, your word order is indicative of your style, this starts to bear more weight to me, okay? That this is a different style. All right, moving on to the next one. Next one, Mark's use of the verbs for seeing with the eyes. Now, the reason why I'm saying it this way is because there are different ways one can say seeing with the eyes, just like we can in English. I can say see, I can say look, I can say perceive, I can say a number of other things. I'm sure you guys could think of more synonyms about when we say to look with your eyes, okay? Mark has a vocabulary range as well. He can use the Greek word harao, he can use the Greek word blepo, he can use the Greek word eido, and he can use the Greek word theomai, okay? He can use those 4 words to indicate that you're going to see something with your eyes. Now, you can see he strongly prefers harao over any of the other ones. And he uses harao almost exactly many times as he uses blepo and eido. And he barely ever uses theomai. Just theomai is not one he typically uses. So, and by the way, eido, those 29 times, eido has a semantic range kind of like we have with the word see, in that it can also mean to understand. Like if I said, do you see what I'm talking about? I'm really asking you, do you understand what I'm talking about? Eido has that same semantic range. And many of those eidos that you see there are the word for understand, not the word to physically see. And that's what we're focused on, is physically seeing. Mark's usage of how to physically see. Now, when we look at this, how many times is this used? All right. Oh, sorry. There's another piece I need to... No, I guess that's correct. There's another piece of this. Not is it just how many times does he use the word, but how many times does he use it prefixed? Remember, word order doesn't matter. Prefixes and suffixes tell you more about the word. We use prefixes in the same way. And so with Mark, the word porumai. Oh, no, you know what? I'm ahead of myself here. I'm ahead of myself. Let's stop here. Theomai. That's the one we need to focus on here for the long ending. Theomai, he only uses 2 times. Long ending only. None of the other 3 uses are found in the long ending. So harao's not in the long ending, blepo's not in the long ending, eido's not in the long ending, theomai is, and theomai is not anywhere else in the Gospel of Mark. So when it comes to perceiving, Mark does not use theomai. So some will argue, well, this isn't about whether or not Mark knows of the word theomai. This is about whether or not Mark uses the word theomai to describe looking. Okay? So if you know me, generally speaking, I don't... Let's say, let's use yourself an example. How often do you use the word perceive to look at something? Right? If I were to pick up a rock and be like, perceive this. You'd be like, that's not how... But what if I did that all the time? What if like that was the way I talked? Perceive this, perceive this. And then if I said, look at this, you'd be like, where's the Eric I know? You'd know immediately that's not me. But if I say, look at this, which is what most people do, look at this, or do you see this, or examine this, right? Something of that nature. And then suddenly I stop using very common vernacular, look and see, and I use something like examine or perceive or something like that. You'd be like, oh, that's weird. Why are you getting so formal? Are you trying to sound smart? You know, something of that nature. That's kind of what we're seeing with Mark here. He's using very common vernacular, look, see, things of that nature. And suddenly in the long ending, he's like, perceive it. And you're like, oh, it's a little formal, Mark. That's not normally how you talk. Okay, that's what we're seeing. All right, now we'll move on to the next one. All right, Mark's use of the word for going. okay? This is going to be a same kind of thing, but a little bit different. Mark's use of the word going is very interesting because in Greek, prefixes and suffixes, just like in English, will give you more information about a word, all right? And in the case of Greek, porumai has a prefix, and a prefix is going to tell you where you're going, okay? Or how you're going to go. So let's say I say something like ek porumai. That means going out of. Or if I said epi porumai, he went from, okay? And so Mark does not tend to use the root word, porumai. He always prefixes it. He always tells you how you're going to go or how that person is going. Are they coming out? Are they going in? Da-da-da-da. How? Just the straight going, as you can see on the thing, the root, he does it 0 times. He never uses just the root word. He always prefixes it. Matthew, he prefixes it sometimes. Most of the time, he uses the root word. That's interesting. We're seeing the flip. Mark always prefixes it, never uses the root word. Matthew prefers the root word. Luke also prefers the root word. Okay? So he prefixes it sometimes, but most of the time he uses the root word. John, he almost never prefixes it, and he almost exclusively uses the root word. So Mark is interesting in the fact that he's always prefixing his going verb. He's always telling you how that person is going. He's adding extra information, except in the long ending. In the long ending, he does. There are 3 times in the long ending where he does use the root word, if he was going to use it. If he was the writer, I should say. So if he was the writer, suddenly he's changed his style altogether. He's gone from exclusively never going without the prefix to now he's adding the prefix 3 times. And he doesn't have the non-prefixed, he doesn't have the prefixed version, a prefixed version in the long ending. To me, that's super interesting. This is someone, again, this is very stylistic. In his style, he likes to give you the extra information about how you're going to go about doing something. In, out, whatever. All of the different prefixes you can think of. Okay? But in his longer ending, he doesn't. Snap will try to demonstrate other places where he uses a word 3 times and nowhere else in the gospel. But the difference between Snap's example and what we're talking about is Snap is using a vocabulary defense. He's saying because Mark is using the prefixed version, he knows about the root version. No one is arguing with that. This isn't about vocabulary. This is about style. Mark's style is to prefix his verbs, his verb for going. That's his style. For him, it's not about does he not know the root word? Of course. No one's arguing that he doesn't know the root word. It's that he just doesn't use it by itself. He always prefixes it. So I don't find Snap to be very convincing here. Lund tries to give a defense for it, but his defense is to try to demonstrate that Mark is using a different source for the longer ending, and that's impacting his style. But the problem is, as you work through Mark is constantly using different sources. And we know that Peter, based on church history, is a constant source for Mark. And so what we don't see is other sources ever impacting his style. For whatever reason, it's only the long ending that impacts his style. And so I don't think that's a very good defense for it as well. Snap will also demonstrate another possibility. This is actually a pretty good, an interesting one, but I don't think it applies as well to this. But what Snap says is Mark is the only gospel writer, I believe, if I remember correctly. Let me see. I think I have it in my notes. Okay, not the only one. The only 2 gospel writers to use the word evangelion, or the word for gospel, is Matthew and Mark. Luke and John do not use the word evangelion, okay? They don't use the word gospel. Matthew and Mark do. Mark starts his gospel with the word gospel. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, okay? And The only other time he uses that word is at the end of the gospel, okay, where he says, I forget the actual phrase. Yeah, so he says the beginning of the Gospel of John, and then, go and preach the gospel in verse 15. Okay, those are the only two times. In my opinion, I think this is actually interesting weight for internal evidence for the authorship of Mark. I think this is good internal evidence. Mark is bookending, just like I could say he was bookending with Lord Jesus. He could be bookending with the word gospel each time. I think that's a good argument for the authorship of Mark. I don't think it's a good argument for style per se, against the fact he's trying to use it to demonstrate that this is not a good argument. I think this argument still stands in light of the fact that Mark might have done the two endings, the gospel endings. The problem is the gospel endings like that are not a true Markism either, where this is a true Markism. In that Mark does this sort of thing on his own. All right, so it's unique to Mark. Now, what's also interesting is let's talk about Markisms on their own. There's a particular scholar by the name of John Charles Doudna. And what he did is he compared Mark to all other popular writings in the first century, both biblical and extra biblical. Compared Mark to all of them. Okay? And his goal was to find out the truly unique things about Mark. What is Mark does that is just unique to him? And when Doudna was done his research, he concluded that there were 21 Markisms, 21 stylistic features that you will only find in Mark. Okay? Now, what's interesting is Doudna does not talk about the long ending at all. Doesn't come up. It's not part of his research. Not that he's not using the long ending, he's just not referencing whether or not it's canon, okay? It's not coming up. So another scholar named Travis Williams, he takes Doudna's work and he overlays those 21 Markisms over the long ending of Mark to try to determine if any one of those 21 show up in the long ending. 0 of them show up in the long ending. Not one. There's not one unique Markism that we can find in the long ending of Mark. So all of this is to say is that when you start comparing all of these stylistic things, the arguments against Mark's authorship for the long ending based on style are very strong. Okay, they're very strong. There's no Markisms. All of his styles that aren't necessarily Markisms, but still show up as his style, like a historic present, not a Markism because it's not unique to Mark. We saw John uses it as well. But we saw that he has a preference for the historic present. Those sorts of things, all of those things that Mark does don't show up in the long ending. So the long ending of Mark, stylistically speaking, just does not appear to be Markan. It doesn't appear to be authored by Mark. When you compare all of that together, this pushes back on the long ending of Mark being canonical, at least as far as Mark being the author, okay? So now let's look at some internal evidence, some other pushback. Let's look at people saying, hey, the long ending must be, or I should put it this way, the abrupt ending cannot be the way Mark intended his gospel, and here's some reasons why. Okay, here's why the abrupt ending can't be how Mark intended to end his gospel. 1, there's no resurrection account. This is probably the one I hear most frequently, and I'm just going to say this is an easy one to rebut. There's a resurrection account. The angel shows up and says, he's risen, okay? So your resurrection account is still there. I'm going to move through these kind of quickly because I'm running out of time and I want to finish this. Number 2, the woman never told anyone that Jesus had risen. Okay, so Mark is either, then how does Mark know? Right? If the woman left and didn't tell anybody, now we have what is sometimes called the omniscient author, right? Where the author knows everything because he's writing the story. So the woman kept it to themselves, kept it secret, didn't tell anybody, and so Mark somehow finds out. It's obvious that the woman eventually told people. It's not to be taken so literally that they didn't tell anyone ever for the rest of their life. They didn't tell anyone, presumably until they got to Peter and the other apostles. The angel said, go tell them, and the woman did not go tell anyone else, is how that should be interpreted. Didn't go tell anyone else. To see a parallel in this, early in Mark, when we have the leper, Mark 1, we have the leper that shows up. Jesus heals him, and Jesus says, don't tell anyone until you get to the priests. And the man doesn't, so he could go get absolved. It's actually an interesting bookend. Okay? There's a lot of parallels that I can't get into here, but if I was preaching through Mark, I would start pointing out all of the parallels between the resurrection account and the account of the man healed from his leprosy. Okay? So, yes, the woman eventually told people. They just ended the story that way. All right, this is more technical. This is more interesting. All right, there's no ancient writing that ends a sentence with the word gar. This used to be, the word gar in Greek is essentially our word, our conjunction for the word for or since. All right, and this is actually taught in a lot of Greek grammar books, at least up until recently, that you don't end a sentence with the word gar in Greek. Don't do it. This is a grammatical rule. What's interesting is this grammatical rule has been shown to be untrue. This happens in English. Don't end your sentence with a preposition, yet we do it all of the time. And we have plenty of people who are like, no, this is not an English rule. This is a Latin rule that's trying to impose on English, but we're not Latin speakers, we're English speakers, so we have English rules, not Latin rules. And so there was a long time where we're like, hey, we just don't end a Greek sentence with the word gar. Don't do it. Which is weird because word order doesn't matter as much in Greek, whereas at least in English, prepositions usually precede the prepositional phrase. So that made more sense, but that's not the case here. So now what do we have? What we have is we have over 200 examples of ancient Greek writings that end their sentences in gar. Okay? What's even more interesting is I can give you two biblical ones. John 13:13 ends that sentence with the word gar. And the other one that is more interesting is Genesis 18:15. And you're like, wait a minute, Genesis 18:15, that's Hebrew, that's not Greek, except when you remember that we spent a lot of time talking about the Septuagint. So what's happening in the Septuagint? In Genesis 18:15, Sarah is laughing because she's just been told she's going to have a child. And the angel confronts her, why are you laughing? And she says, I didn't. And then an explanation is given, because she was afraid, which is the exact same sentence that ends the Gospel of Mark, because they were afraid. And they end exactly the same way. The Greek grammar construction is identical, with the exception was it's a singular feminine pronoun in Genesis versus a plural feminine pronoun in Mark, in the long-ending Mark. But this construction is identical. So to me, this is a silly rule. And then they'll say, okay, you're right. You can end a sentence in Greek, but you can't end a work. I mean, you can end a sentence in gar. You can't end a work in gar. Okay? To me, it's a silly argument because if you can end a sentence in gar, you can end a work in gar. That just seems logical to me. But we also have other narratives that end with the word gar. And let's see. Do I talk about this? No. What I do say is that it is true that it doesn't happen frequently. It's not a normal thing. It's a rare thing, but it's not an unheard of thing, and it's certainly not a grammar rule. Okay? Keep in mind, yes, of course, it's a rare thing, but how many words can you end a narrative with? So many. So the fact that gar is sometimes not that word is not super uncommon. There was actually someone who did a whole ratio. They did a whole chart of the ratio of words that end a particular narrative, and then add that ratio to the narratives that end with the word gar. And statistically speaking, it was low statistically, but so many words were low statistically, and it wasn't statistically significant, the difference. So that was interesting. The statistics weren't a difference, okay? Next one. The ending in general is unlike any ending in any other ancient work because it ends so abruptly. This is not the case at all. For example, read the book of Jonah. That work ends very abruptly. Read the book of Acts, how that ends. That leaves you wanting more, okay? After 2 years, Paul was imprisoned in his house, and he kept preaching. You're like, well, what about the trial that he's waiting for at the end of that 2 years? Luke doesn't tell you. He just ends it. You're like, I kind of want to know. All right, I think the ending of the Gospel of Acts, not the Gospel, the the Acts of the Apostles is genius. I think it's really genius how Luke does it, but he ends it abruptly. He does not tell the story, and he's there for the story because he knows he was there for 2 years. So he's written he didn't write the 2 year mark at the 1 year mark. He wrote the 2 year mark at the 2 year mark when it stopped, and something happened, and Luke doesn't cover it. He leaves you hanging. Okay, we have another book that's kind of like that. It's called the Aeneid by Virgil. Virgil's the author. He's super interesting. He has a character named Aeneas. This has to do with the founding of Rome. Aeneas is the founder of Rome, and he does this ending where Aeneas, the main character, is fighting his antagonist. And the book ends with Aeneas thrusting the sword into this last guy during the final battle. And the book ends with the guy, his body going limp. And that's the end of the book. His body went limp. Boom, end of story. And yet there's so much more to cover about the founding of Rome, but he leaves it abruptly. All this to say is this is not the norm, just like it's not the norm in today's writing, but it's not unheard of either. And by the way, that particular story is contemporary with Mark. Mark would have known about that story. He probably could have read it. Okay? What's also really interesting, super interesting, is that a lot of people were dissatisfied with how the Aeneid by Virgil ended, and they began to write their own endings into the book. And so some scholars have suggested maybe that's how people felt about the ending of Mark, that they were just unsatisfied and began to write their own endings. Leave that out there for you. That's interesting. All right, I got to move quick because I'm going to go a little long if I don't. All right, Mark's foreshadowing earlier in the account tells us how it will end. We have the resurrection appearances that he says is going to happen, but it doesn't happen later. The problem is there's a lot of foreshadowing in all of the gospel writers where they say certain things are going to happen and they never actually happen in the story itself. Not that they don't happen, they just don't narrate it. So this is not super uncommon. Mark can do this as well. He can foreshadow things that he doesn't report on later. A gospel cannot properly end without physical appearances, and I would just say, who says? Where's the rule? And I find that a lot of times people make these rules because they are inferences. So they'll say, well, 3 gospels have this function that Jesus shows up with physical appearances. Therefore, all 4 should have it. Well, maybe, but maybe that wasn't Mark's intent. Maybe he had no intention of putting physical appearances in because he didn't want to put physical appearances in. Okay? So there's that. You don't want to assume the conclusion, and that's what's happening here. In my opinion, you're assuming the conclusion. All right, and then motive. All right, I'm going to skip this, but this is where I'll come back with the review next week. But why would someone remove the longer ending, or why would someone add the long ending? We need to come up with some sort of motive. And the bottom line answer is which reading best explains all the other readings. I'll finish it next week. And then I want to talk about what do we do with this, if I can get it to go to the next slide. The next slide will be, what do we do with this? We can either make it canon, good and useful, or rejected. There's no ecclesiastical historical account for why we would reject the long ending of Mark, okay? Most people, I'm in the minority here, most people are going to say it's good and useful, like the woman caught in adultery. It's not canon, but it's good and useful. I, on the other hand, think it's canon. I lean towards canon, okay? I am not dogmatic about this by any means. If it were a scale, I'm on the just slightly, possibly canon, and I think other people are slightly possible not canon. I will give my justification for why next week. I want to end with Dirk Jonken talking about the long ending. Then I'll end this section. We'll just do a quick refresher next week before we get into the next section. But Dirk Jonken is a text critic. He does the Greek New Testament. I'll introduce it next week. And he comments with Duane Green on an interview why he doesn't think, or what he would do with the long ending. Let me let him speak.
You had actually had the long ending of Mark put into the text. So it's right in there, Mark 16, 9 through 20. So I take it that you're convinced that Mark 16, 9 through 20 should be part of the scriptures since it's in the THGNT?
Well, this was the only place in the Tyndale House edition where we have actually sort of an introductory note in the Tyndale House edition, which is definitely not part of scripture. And the introductory note is taken from minuscule 1, saying that in many of the manuscripts the following words are not found, but some of these have also this, and then we get the long ending. In the end, the issue of the long ending of Mark is for me much less of a clear-cut case than it is apparently for many other text critics. I think everyone will agree that the long ending of Mark is written in a different voice than the rest of Mark. So up to Mark 69, the Greek is in general fairly simple. Looks a little bit like somebody who is using Greek as a second language, kind of a limited number of linguistic devices, limited vocab, limited number of sentence structures, etc. And then in the long ending, you get a completely different register. You can affirm or you can deny that, but I think most linguists will agree on that. Does a change in voice always means a change in author? And that is, of course, probably not true, especially if we go with the church tradition that Mark is supposed to record Peter's teaching in Rome. What if Peter stopped and then, perhaps Mark himself took over to finish the gospel?
Right.
Because I cannot exclude this, therefore I find it quite hazardous to exclude the long ending of Mark from the Bible, mainly based on the testimony of two very early manuscripts, and normally quite good manuscripts, and the sort of ongoing textual discussion that we have had within the patristic literature since the days of Eusebius. So it is clearly a problem since the days of Eusebius. I think it is still a problem now, and I don't think that we have really satisfactorily solved this.
So when you have it in the text of the THGNT, you're not necessarily saying, I agree with this and I think it's scripture. I just think that we shouldn't excise it based on the information that we have. Would that be a good synopsis of your position there?
Yeah, I think so, yes. And also because we put in an explicit note saying that, look, this is the status of this particular section.
What about the story of the woman caught in adultery? Can you tell us a little bit about how the THGNT has handled that?
This is the famous story in John 8, of course, the last verse of John 7, and then the first 11 verses of John 8. Here, the external evidence for its not being part of the Gospel of John is much, much stronger than for the long ending of Mark. So the external confirmation that for the first centuries, 5-6 centuries, perhaps only a very few manuscripts will have contained this particular story in the Gospel of John. It is quite strong. So therefore, I did not feel it appropriate to include a section which I know is loved by many people and is very used as an illustration, etc., but to include those verses and interrupt the flow of thought that I think is how John 7-8 should be read. So that is without the breaking in of this particular story.
Right. So aside.
Okay, that's it. I'm going to let you guys go because I went long, but we'll do a quick review at the end next week before we start the next section, and we'll pick up from there. I'll even give a little bit of commentary on what Dirk said. You all are dismissed. Thank you.